The courtroom was packed with reporters and spectators, all eager to witness the most anticipated trial of the year. The case involved the mysterious murder of a well-known CEO, a beloved figure in the community whose sudden death had rocked the business world. The accused, a former employee who had been fired under controversial circumstances, was facing charges that seemed to have circumstantial evidence stacking against him. Yet, some believed there was more to the story. This was no ordinary murder case. Rumors swirled about corporate espionage, betrayal, and a hidden fortune that could change lives. The media painted a picture of a broken man seeking revenge, but a few jurors knew this was more complicated than it seemed. As the trial proceeded, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The defense argued that the evidence against the defendant was circumstantial and that he was being framed by powerful figures with motives of their own. Meanwhile, the prosecution painted a dark picture of a disgruntled former employee with emotional outbursts that suggested deep anger toward his former employer. The nation's eyes were on the jury, for this case had the potential to influence future corporate law and public trust in powerful institutions. The pressure on the jurors was immense, as they had to deliberate not only the fate of the accused, but also the moral dilemma of a justice system that had so many unanswered questions. In the midst of this chaos, one juror, the protagonist, sat quietly, observing every move and carefully considering the evidence. They weren't quick to judge, aware that the media had already shaped public opinion before the trial had even begun. This juror had lived through enough injustice to know that things weren't always as they seemed. With each piece of evidence, they became more convinced that this was no ordinary case of revenge or corporate malfeasance. Something darker was at play. Their instincts were telling them there was more to this story, and they weren't about to let a false narrative sway them. But they hadn't yet realized just how deep the conspiracy went, and how close they would come to uncovering a hidden agenda within the jury itself. The jurors were a mix of personalities, ranging from seasoned professionals to ordinary citizens who had never been involved in a trial of such magnitude. The room was filled with conflicting opinions, heated arguments, and moments of silence that dragged on as they tried to come to a consensus. At first, it seemed like any other jury room, people quietly discussing the evidence, trying to stick to the facts. But as the deliberations continued, there were odd moments. One juror, a man in his mid-40s, kept raising his hand with irrelevant questions, steering the conversation away from critical evidence and trying to play down certain testimonies. Another juror, a woman with a piercing gaze, seemed to take issue with the way some of the evidence was presented, questioning the credibility of key witnesses and subtly discrediting the prosecution's case. The protagonist, who was keenly observant, began to notice these subtle disturbances. It wasn't just the arguments or the differences of opinion. It was something more deliberate, something insidious. The juror who had been raising questions kept avoiding direct answers when asked about his own opinions. There were moments when he would glance at his phone under the table, typing messages in quick succession, as if communicating with someone outside the jury room. The protagonist's suspicions grew, but they couldn't put their finger on what was wrong. Every time they tried to subtly bring attention to these odd behaviors, the other jurors seemed too distracted or too eager to make the trial move along smoothly. It was clear that some jurors were ready to reach a verdict quickly, almost as if they were eager to be rid of the case and its complexities. The protagonist's unease began to gnaw at them. They knew that something wasn't right. The deliberations grew more intense, and the man's behavior seemed to escalate. He would raise doubts over minor points, and on several occasions, he manipulated the room by redirecting the conversation when the evidence started to build against the defendant. It felt as though he was trying to derail the truth, trying to guide the jury toward a specific conclusion. At first, it was subtle, a little nudge here, a suggestion there. But the protagonist began to realize that this wasn't random. There was purpose behind it. The suspicion was now undeniable. One of the jurors had a hidden agenda tied directly to the trial. The protagonist spent a sleepless night turning over the events in their mind. They kept replaying the strange behavior of the other juror, the glances at the phone, the subtle avoidance of key points, the odd insistence on minor details. The next day, their suspicions were confirmed in an unexpected way. During a break in deliberations, the protagonist overheard the suspicious juror talking on the phone just outside the jury room. It wasn't a casual conversation. It was a tense exchange. "You need to get your story straight before tomorrow," the juror hissed into the receiver. "If we don't sway them now, this whole thing falls apart. Make sure he's in the right place at the right time." The protagonist froze, their heart racing. It was clear that the juror was working with someone outside the jury room, and that the fix was in. As soon as the juror hung up, the protagonist stepped back into the room, their mind spinning. What had they just heard? Was this a case of bribery? Or was the juror merely following orders from someone with a larger agenda? Either way, it was a direct violation of the sacred responsibility they held as a juror. They couldn't let it go. Too much was at stake. But confronting the juror directly could be dangerous. The last thing they wanted was to become the target of a larger conspiracy. Yet, with the weight of justice pressing down on them, they knew they had no choice but to dig deeper. With renewed determination, the protagonist began to gather evidence quietly. They started by observing the suspicious juror more closely, taking note of every gesture, every word, every inconsistency. It was like piecing together a puzzle, and as the pieces fell into place, the picture became even more chilling. The juror wasn't just trying to influence the verdict, they were orchestrating the entire jury's decision. There was a hidden agenda, and it was bigger than anyone had realized. But who was the mastermind behind it all, and what was their stake in this trial? The protagonist was getting closer to the truth, but every step forward made the situation more dangerous. They were now not only facing a conspiracy within the jury, but the shadowy forces pulling its strings from the outside. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together as the protagonist dug deeper. It was clear now that the juror wasn't acting alone. There were whispers of a powerful corporate group involved, one with deep ties to the victim's company and the accused. The juror, as it turned out, was an insider, someone who had worked closely with the victim before the murder. The protagonist learned that the juror had been under financial strain, and it seemed that he had been bribed, or blackmailed, by powerful figures to sway the verdict in favor of the defendant. The revelation was shocking. This wasn't just about a manipulated verdict, it was about a conspiracy with far-reaching implications. One fateful evening, as the jury debated their final vote, the protagonist decided to confront the suspicious juror. They followed him to the restroom, cornering him in a narrow hallway. "I know what you're doing," the protagonist said, voice low but firm. "You've been feeding us lies. You're not just influencing this trial, you're trying to control it." The juror's eyes widened, his expression faltering for a brief second before he recovered. "You have no idea what you're getting into," he muttered, before glancing over his shoulder as if checking for eavesdroppers. "You're making a mistake." It was the first time the protagonist saw fear in his eyes, and it was enough to confirm everything. This wasn't about the case. It was personal. With this confrontation, the protagonist knew they had to act fast. The other jurors were still unaware of the situation, and the trial was drawing to a close. The tension was unbearable as the protagonist devised a plan to expose the conspiracy without putting themselves in immediate danger. They had no choice but to bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. The clock was ticking, and with every passing moment, the stakes grew higher. They were no longer just deciding the fate of one person. They were standing in the way of a dangerous agenda that could destroy everything. The final showdown was imminent, and everything would come down to this pivotal moment. The protagonist's mind raced as they returned to the jury room, trying to digest the confrontation with the suspicious juror. They had uncovered a crucial piece of the puzzle, but it wasn't enough. To expose the conspiracy, they needed hard evidence, not just a whisper of a threat. The manipulative juror was clever. He had covered his tracks well, and the protagonist could feel the weight of the looming danger. If they failed, the wrong verdict would be reached, and innocent lives could be destroyed. But exposing this would require meticulous planning, or the antagonist would slip through the cracks. They had to be careful. With the clock ticking down, The protagonist spent the next few days observing the manipulative juror even more closely. Every action seemed deliberate now, and the protagonist grew more convinced that the entire jury was being controlled in subtle ways. The juror frequently received strange messages, and there were brief, hushed conversations that hinted at something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. There were discussions that didn't seem related to the trial at all, references to the victim's private business dealings and other obscure details that shouldn't have been in the jury's purview. They began to realize that the trial was a smokescreen for something far larger, something involving organized crime, corporate power, and deep personal vendettas. To find the smoking gun, the protagonist took risks. They decided to follow the manipulative juror after one of the jury breaks. This decision led them to a private meeting with a shadowy figure, an individual they immediately recognized as a powerful lawyer with connections to the victim's company. The conversation they overheard confirmed their worst fears. The juror had been promised money and protection in exchange for ensuring a verdict in favor of the accused. The stakes were higher than the protagonist had ever imagined. This wasn't just about influencing a trial. It was a battle between two powerful factions with the jury caught in the middle. The tension in the jury room was palpable. Every juror was under pressure, and no one seemed to realize the gravity of what was at stake. The manipulative juror had become increasingly aggressive in his push for a "not guilty" verdict. His arguments had shifted from subtle suggestions to outright demands. The protagonist knew they couldn't let this go on. The evidence was stacked against the defendant, but the jury's deliberations were being systematically skewed. The protagonist struggled with a moral dilemma. How far would they go to expose the truth? They had gathered enough evidence to accuse the manipulative juror outright, but doing so could fracture the jury, and there was no guarantee the truth would come out. What if the juror's supporters tried to discredit them? The protagonist considered going to the judge, but they feared retaliation from the corporate powers involved. In secret, they decided to continue gathering evidence and quietly warn the others. Time was running out, and the final vote was approaching. The risk of being exposed was growing, but the protagonist felt they had no choice but to push forward. Their opportunity came when the jury took a lunch break. The manipulative juror slipped out of the room, leaving behind his phone. The protagonist seized the moment, quickly rifling through the phone's messages and contacts. The pieces clicked into place. The juror had been in constant contact with the mysterious lawyer, as well as several unnamed individuals tied to shady business dealings. The final nail in the coffin was a damning email sent just a day before deliberations started, outlining a clear plan to influence the jury's decision. With this evidence, the protagonist felt a surge of determination. They had what they needed to expose the conspiracy. But now, they had to act fast before the manipulative juror could destroy it all. With their newfound evidence in hand, the protagonist knew they had reached the point of no return. The final vote was only hours away, and the manipulative juror was pushing harder than ever for the verdict they wanted. The protagonist had no more time to second-guess themselves. They could either keep quiet, let the system be manipulated, or they could expose the conspiracy and risk everything. During a tense moment in deliberations, as the jury debated the final points of the trial, the protagonist stood up and made an unexpected declaration. "I have evidence that someone in this room is trying to sway the verdict," they said, their voice steady but firm. The room went silent. Every juror turned to look at the protagonist, their eyes filled with confusion and suspicion. The manipulative juror shifted uncomfortably in his seat, a bead of sweat trickling down his forehead. He had been caught, but he wasn't ready to give up. Without giving the antagonist time to react, the protagonist revealed the phone records and the incriminating email. The jury room erupted into chaos. The manipulative juror tried to defend himself, but his lies quickly fell apart under the weight of the evidence. The other jurors looked on in disbelief, unsure of what to believe. Some were shocked into silence, while others began to question everything they had heard during deliberations. The protagonist knew they were walking a dangerous line, but this was the only way to ensure justice. The truth had come to light, and there was no turning back. The manipulative juror was cornered, his facade crumbling as the other jurors began to understand the depth of the betrayal. One juror stood up, shaking their head in disbelief. "You've been lying to us all along? How could you do this?" Another juror shouted, "This is a miscarriage of justice." The protagonist, standing tall, watched as the manipulative juror's false confidence shattered. The juror tried to make a last-ditch attempt to salvage his position, but it was too late. The evidence was irrefutable, and the truth was now out in the open. But the manipulative juror wasn't done yet. In a desperate attempt to save himself, he turned to the protagonist, his eyes cold and vengeful. "You think you've won?" he spat. "You're just a pawn in a much bigger game. You have no idea what you've just started." The room fell into stunned silence. It was clear that there were forces at play far beyond this jury room, powerful forces with their own agenda. The protagonist felt the weight of those words. They had exposed the conspiracy, but now they knew they had just scratched the surface. The trial was over, the verdict was delivered, but the war was far from finished. As the jury deliberated their final decision in light of the new information, the protagonist couldn't help but wonder if they had just opened Pandora's box. The forces behind the manipulative juror were far more dangerous than they could have imagined, and the battle for justice was far from over. The aftermath of the revelation was immediate. The manipulative juror was removed from the jury, and the rest of the deliberations proceeded with a newfound sense of clarity. The protagonist watched as the jury came together, their decision more unified than before. The verdict was reached, guilty, as it should have been from the beginning. But even as the courtroom erupted in applause and relief, the protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that this was only a small victory in a much larger battle. The manipulative juror, once a key player in the conspiracy, was arrested along with several other individuals connected to the crime syndicate. But even as the law closed in on them, the protagonist knew that the story didn't end there. The lawyer and the hidden power structures that had tried to sway the jury remained at large, and their reach extended far beyond this one trial. The protagonist had only uncovered a piece of the puzzle. There were still many questions left unanswered. The protagonist's role in the trial had changed their life forever. They were no longer just a juror. They were a witness to something far larger than themselves. Justice had been served, but the fight for truth was far from over. With the conspiracy exposed, the protagonist walked away knowing that, for now, the right decision had been made. But the world they had stepped into was far darker than they could have ever imagined. In the weeks that followed, the protagonist found themselves in a whirlwind of media attention and legal proceedings. They were hailed as a hero by some, a whistleblower who had saved the integrity of the justice system. But the protagonist knew better. They had seen the dangers of the hidden agenda, and the shadowy figures who had tried to manipulate the case were still out there. The victory, though sweet, came with a price. The manipulative juror and his co-conspirators were brought to justice, but whispers of other cases involving similar corruption began to surface. The protagonist was left with a sense of foreboding, knowing that exposing this one conspiracy might only be the tip of the iceberg. As they left the courthouse for the final time, they glanced at the sky, wondering what new challenges lay ahead. What would you do if you were in that jury room? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, give it a like, share it with a friend, and don't forget to subscribe for more jaw-dropping stories like this one.